Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Leon Hartwell. I'm a Sotrov Fellow at LSE IDEAS. Welcome to another LSE IDEAS Russia-Ukraine Dialogue. We've set up the dialogues in response to the February escalation of the war, which is one of the most consequential events of our time. The conflict continues to be fluid and requires cross-disciplinary analysis. Our dialogues take place every Tuesday at the same time. According to the UN, there are now more than 4.2 million Ukrainian refugees. In addition, there are over 6.5 million internally displaced people. I'm sorry, those figures are incorrect. The humanitarian crisis as a direct result of this conflict should not be underestimated. According to the UN, 7.1 million Ukrainians have been internally displaced, and 4.79 million people have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries. That is, 1 out of 4 Ukrainians have been displaced and lost their homes. To put it differently, the amount of Ukrainians who have been displaced now equals that of the entire population of countries like Belgium, Burundi, Haiti, or South Sudan. The fight for Mariupol continues unabated, while Russian troops have now begun to concentrate on Donbass. Meanwhile, President Putin has awarded honorary titles to a brigade that committed mass atrocities in Bucha. This week, we will be focusing on the impact of the war on the Balkans. We have 3 distinguished panelists. First, I'd like to welcome Kosovo's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kreshnik Ahmeti. Our second speaker is a member of the House of Representatives of the Parliament of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Honorable Sabina Ćudić. Finally, I'd like to welcome Milena Lazarevic, one of the founders of the program and program director of the Belgrade-based think tank, the European Policy Center. Welcome. Thank you to all 3 speakers for joining us. Those of us who have been following the news in the Balkans will know that it is one of the regions that most closely follow events in Ukraine. One of the reasons being that the Yugoslav wars are still fresh in the memories of people across the Balkans. Now, let's turn to Kosovo first. For context, the Kosovo War took place between 98 to 99, and it was ended following NATO intervention. Then in 2008, Kosovo formally declared independence from Serbia. The US and over 100 states recognized its independence, while Serbia, Russia, and 5 EU member states do not. As a result, the so-called Belgrade-Pristina dialogue continues with the goal of, quote-unquote, normalizing relations between Serbia and Kosovo. Now, Deputy Minister, how has Putin's war in Ukraine affected the situation in Kosovo? And how has Kosovo responded to this crisis? Thank you.
Well, first of all, Leon, thank you for the invitation and this opportunity, and greetings to all the participants. Putin's war and military aggression in Ukraine did not come as a surprise to us. The writing was on the wall for some time. And also from our experience in the wars in former Yugoslavia, the narrative that he was building prior to the war was a signal that the war is possible to happen, even though there were many skeptics regarding it. We've seen the same narrative from Milosevic's regime prior to the war in Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the war in Kosovo. On a personal level, the images that we saw from this Russian Federation aggression brought back memories of our own experiences. The mass deportation, the war crimes, mass destruction of cities and villages are familiar to us. I've experienced it myself. We've been deported from our houses first, as 80% of our population was, then out of our country, that 50% of the population was. And also it came as no surprise when we came back that our houses were burnt and destroyed, as 120,000 houses were in Kosovo. But as a country, we mobilized when the war in Ukraine started. And we aligned our foreign policy with our Western partners. And on the first day, on the 24th of February, we put out an open statement, a joint statement of the Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Speaker of the Parliament, and the President, which condemned the military aggression in Ukraine and also condemned the illegal recognition of the so-called independence of those two Ukrainian regions. We continue to synchronize our sanctions with United States, UK, EU, Canada, and other countries. We have also taken steps in regards to Ukrainian refugees. To give a bit of a background, unfortunately, until now, Kosovo and Ukraine do not have diplomatic relations, so it was a problem for Ukrainian citizens to transit or even to come to Kosovo. On the first weeks of the war, we had a high number of requests from Ukrainian citizens to transit through Kosovo or to come into Kosovo. And we decided to temporarily lift the visa regime in order for them to transit, but also to host Ukrainian refugees. We are hosting 20 Ukrainian journalists and their families in Kosovo and creating the necessary conditions for them to work from Kosovo. We also committed to host 5,000 refugees. We already allocated funds to send humanitarian aid. And also in coordination with a number of private and public universities in Kosovo, we are offering Ukrainian students to continue their studies in English programs, accredited English programs in Kosovo, either by being physically in Kosovo or visually from distance. So these are some of the steps that we've been taking in regards to the military aggression of the Russian Federation in Ukraine.
Thank you, Kreshnik, for that. We'll circle back to you on with a few more questions, but let's first turn to Sabina. 30 years ago, in April 1992, the Bosnian War broke out, and the war was ended in 1995 after the army of Republika Srpska suffered major losses following joint operations by the army of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Croatian Defense Council, as well as NATO intervention. While the Dayton Peace Agreement formally ended the armed conflict, it did not automatically transform Bosnia into a multicultural democracy. Now, before the escalation, Sabina, of Putin's actions in Ukraine, many observers were concerned that the frozen conflict in Bosnia may unfreeze due to certain actions taken by leaders in Bosnia and Herzegovina, who are stoking fires around the three main identity groups. Now, can you perhaps tell us a little bit more about that and give us your take on how this war is impacting on Bosnia? Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. Well, you covered it well in your introduction. One should also mention that it is not about Ukraine further destabilizing necessarily Bosnia and Herzegovina, but it's actually shedding light to something that we have been pointing out for years, that there are serious political and now even security threats to Bosnia and Herzegovina in terms of Russian malign influence in the region and in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I will remind you, for those who are watching and thinking about the wider perhaps perspective, Russia attempted coup in Montenegro during the elections. There was election meddling in Macedonia. There are clear ties, and all the research points to increased, actually, and not decreased popularity of Russia in the past 2 months in Serbia. And there is the attempt of creation of Russian puppet state in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I dare say it, through the policies of Serb leader in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Milorad Dodik, but also ties of other politicians in Bosnia and Herzegovina to Russia, and Russia using them for their political gains and using this Bosnia and Herzegovina as essentially a chip at the negotiating table about the wider picture of Russian influence in Europe. So in that sense, this has been happening for a while, and it didn't happen overnight. But obviously, the increased attention that came as a result of war in Ukraine is something that is one of the obviously reasons why we are even talking today. Just hours ago, before our talk, Serb leader Milorad Dodik said at a panel in Belgrade, I think everybody noticed that Bosniaks in Bosnia and Herzegovina have managed to get the foreigners on their side as a result of Ukrainian crisis, meaning that his plans for the Republika Srpska are essentially now being jeopardized because of the foreign attention in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I will remind you that Milorad Dodik met with Putin in December 2021 in a closed meeting in Moscow, from which we didn't get the conclusions. Then he spoke to Lavrov just days after the invasion in Ukraine, where in all the things that the Russian diplomat, that the Russian foreign minister could have been doing in that moment, he decided to speak to Milorad Dodik, and in the public statement they made, the Russian embassy in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they said that they were following up on the agreements made in December with Putin in Moscow. So this gives you an idea of re-traumatizing effect that war in Ukraine has on Bosnians. Of course, not only the atrocities that we endured, and the war that we endured is kind of, we see it through the lens of our own experience, what is happening in Ukraine, but also the question of never again is obviously on the minds of Bosnians who are thinking that despite the lesson, has anybody learned the lessons from Western Balkans, and should the policy of appeasement continue? I think it's been played very unsuccessfully by the international community in the Balkans, and it's now coming for its, I would say, at least political victims.
Thank you, Sabina. Let's turn to Milena now in Belgrade. Now, Milena, there were pro-Russian supporters on the streets of Belgrade to protest against Serbia's support for Russia's suspension from the UN Human Rights Council. But at the same time, Serbia is also one of a handful of European countries that chose not to impose sanctions against Russia. President Vučić has complained that Western countries are pressuring him to ditch his Russian friends. Can you shed some light on the Russia-Serbia relationship? And can you tell us how the Russia-Ukraine war has impacted those relations? Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. As I think is quite widely known, Serbia has been quite closely related with Russia, and there have been, let's say, quite strong emotional and I would say even sentimental relationships nurtured between the governments of Russia and Serbia. This is something that is not new. This is something that it has been quite traditional, and it has been the trait of all governments, I would say, without exception, not only since the democratic transition, but also, of course, in the period preceding it. But I would say that from the mid-2000s, especially, this relationship has mainly been based on the perception of national interests, and particularly based on Russia's support to Serbia's position in the dispute between Serbia and Kosovo on the status of Kosovo, and Russia's position in the UN Security Council. And this is no secret, this is quite clear. At the same time, over the years, Serbia has, regardless of the quality and of the democratic, let's say, provenience and quality of the governments that we have had, Serbia has been gradually integrating with the European Union, especially economically. And nowadays, we can definitely see that Serbia's position is clearly supposed to be in the European Union and with the EU mainstream, and not anywhere else. Especially if you look at trade, economy, investments, all the numbers speak in favor of that. So in that way, one could say that this emotional relationship with Russia has been somehow unnatural or even let's say somehow a flaw of the whole situation. The war has only exacerbated, I would say, the divisions in Serbia, which have existed all throughout the beginning of the 21st century in particular, but which were maybe, because of the events around the world and because Russia was so much integrated with the EU, because there was so much cooperation with Russia by EU countries, for example, by Germany and other EU countries, which are now struggling to let's say, remove themselves from previous collaboration and joint projects with Russia. Now the war has, of course, exacerbated these divisions in Serbia. As before, the civil society in Serbia is quite strongly committed to the EU and to the EU's positions, and is insisting and calling for alignment of Serbia's foreign policy with the EU's foreign policy and with the EU's positions and sanctions towards Russia. Part of the opposition is also moving in that direction, but I would say also not a big part of the opposition, because we have just come out of the electoral cycle, and obviously I would say that most of the political leaders in Serbia, and most of the leaders of most of the political parties were had quite a cowardly position in the pre-electoral campaign when it comes to tackling this issue. And I think that nobody wanted to lose any votes because, by somehow stirring the waters, which were already stirred in any case. So it was already, in a way, a lost battle. But I would say that we have to, when we speak about Serbia's position and Serbia's relationship with Russia, we really have to look differently at the pre-electoral and the post-electoral. So before the 4th of April and after the 4th of April period. And I have to say that, of course, it's unfortunate that a stance on this horrible war and horrible aggression had to become somehow a function of the electoral campaign in Serbia, but this is the reality, and we have to simply lucidly and objectively analyze it. Before the election, there were timid, and I would even say forced, alignments with the mainstream European positions in the UN. Serbia did vote in favor of the resolution which condemned the Russian aggression in Ukraine with very strong wording. And it also, interestingly, on the 14th of March, endorsed one sanction against Yanukovych and several other related individuals. It was an old sanction which was simply renewed by the European Union on the 4th of March, and Serbia for the first time endorsed a sanction targeting Russian citizens, because Yanukovych and these other individuals are Russian citizens. But it was a precedent, and for those who follow and who analyze Serbia's foreign policy, this was a bit of a conundrum, because this happened before the elections. Now, after the elections, we have not seen concrete alignment with the sanctions yet, but we have observed two important phenomena. One is that now Serbia has already voted for expelling Russia from the Human Rights Council in the United Nations. So it was a follow-up of the alignment in the UN. But what we can also see, and we mainly see that in the pro-governmental media, this is what I would call the preparation of the public for what is to come. And I think that this is my personal opinion and the opinion of some of my colleagues in the civil society. You may call us optimists or not. But we expect that there is going to be a shift, a gradual shift, probably not, just a U-turn overnight, but a gradual shift in Serbia's alignment and Serbia's position vis-a-vis Russia, and even in terms of adoption and alignment with EU sanctions. We can see that, as I said, in mainstream media, the most watched pro-governmental media, not only the printed one, tabloids, but also on television. We can observe more and more wide and quite long TV shows, political shows, where the public is basically being served now the information that the EU is our main ally, that our position is in the EU, that Russia has not always been our friend, that Serbia historically was not always so closely aligned with Russia, that Russia is in fact doing a lot against its own interests in the international community, that it is burning its bridges with Europe, that it is doing something that is completely irrational and unnatural, that they're committing huge atrocities in Ukraine. More and more, I mean, it's still small numbers compared to other European countries, but as of 4 days ago, 6,000 Ukrainian refugees are in Serbia. The Serbian patriarch met with the Ukrainian refugees and offered support. We also see now the reaction of the pro-Russian elite in Serbia. They're even already organizing a petition against Serbia's future alignment with the sanctions against Russia. So you can already see that not only the wider public or not only the intellectuals and think tankers, but slowly the public, the wider public and experts also are observing and seeing and expecting this shift to happen. For those of us who are already eager to see Serbia finally pick a side, this is something that we are eagerly expecting to happen and that we hope will happen. And of course, for those who are against it, I think that we can expect more reactions, we can expect more opposition, but you know, historically speaking, this is going to be quite a major shift for a country like Serbia if this is to happen. And I'm sure that there will be a lot of internal opposition. But, you know, with this renewed and very strong political mandate, if we can say that there is one positive thing about, you know, Serbia having such a strong and authoritarian regime, which of course I would never say there is anything good about it. But in this situation, if we can, for example, call the glass half full, I would say that at least what we can expect is more audacity and bolder policy in terms of aligning with the EU. And maybe further on in the discussion, I can say a few words about what I think the EU should be doing and what I think the EU has already been doing in order to help Serbia make that shift. But we can leave that for the next. For the next round.
You've given us plenty to work with, Milena, so we'll come back to those issues. I'm very interested in your optimism also in going forward. But as you said, President Vučić now has yet another mandate, you know, that he has secured following these election. So the question is, what is
if I can say just, you know, formally it's his last mandate. And I would say that for somebody who has such a high opinion of himself and who wants to be remembered in history by something, I think that he realizes which is the one thing he might be remembered for by the end of this mandate in 2027. And that could be EU membership. I don't think that there is anything, you know, else that he could be remembered by, so.
Okay, all right, we'll come back to that point for sure. Thank you for that. Let's go back to Deputy Minister Ahmeti. I'd like to ask you, while we're talking about Serbia-Kosovo relations, you obviously, sorry, Serbia-Russia relations and Serbia-Kosovo relations, you obviously also follow Russia quite closely. Especially given its role in the UN Security Council and what it has done in relation to your sort of dispute with Serbia. Now, in September last year, there was the border flare-up following a dispute about number plates, and President Vučić sent tanks to the border, where Russia's ambassador also conducted meetings with Serbia's Minister of Defense. Now, all of this happened in the context of joint military exercises that were happening between Serbia and Russia. Then shortly before the February escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war, Putin met with President Vučić. Now, what is your impression of that meeting and the context in which it took place?
Well, regarding the as you called it, the flare-up at the border, maybe just a bit of background for the audience. As most of you might know, there has been a process of dialogue facilitated by Brussels by EU in Brussels between Kosovo and Belgrade for over a decade now. And 33 agreements at different level have been reached within this process. 2/3 of those agreements are not implemented by Serbia since then. And one of those was an agreement on licensed car plates. So this agreement was a temporary one, and we were respecting it unilaterally. So before it expired in, if I'm not mistaken, 15th of September last year, we notified EU, as the agreement sanctioned, that the agreement is ending. We're open to use car plates of both countries as they are, with logos and everything. But we heard nothing back from the Serbian side, and we started reciprocity measures. So now this was the moment when a campaign of, how to say, controlled escalation from Serbia started. At first, they tried to mobilize citizens, Serbian citizens in Kosovo to block the roads, and they could only mobilize a bit over 100, because even, I believe, even the Serb citizens in Kosovo are tired of these kinds of situations. And when this failed as a project, they started a campaign of fake news, trying to portray the Kosovo police as provoking and violating Serbs in the north municipalities. And we should know that Russia comes into this context because of its so-called humanitarian center in Niš, which is actually an intelligence service center. And our police forces arrested two Russian agents in those roadblocks who entered illegally into Kosovo. So Russia was implicated in there. And when this fake news campaign failed also, two of our institutions, two of our state agencies were attacked. One building was burned down and the other one was attacked by hand grenades. And then Serbia mobilized its army in the border and even flew fighter jets donated by Russia close to our border. And while all of this was happening, the Russian ambassador with his military attaché, not by chance, visited the border and looked with binoculars to Kosovo, towards Kosovo. So all these provocations went down because our police forces did a really good job, and nobody was, so to say, discriminated. Many license plates were transferred to the legal ones, and now this issue is being discussed in the Brussels, within the dialogue. But we also just recently had 4 attacks on our police forces within 3 days last week, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And 2 of those attacks came from Serbia's territory with hand grenades and AK-47. So I believe Serbia is in a really tough position for itself because it cannot sit on 4 chairs anymore. You know, it's not US and China, EU and Russia. So this situation after the Russia's aggression in Ukraine has constrained its space of maneuver. But even these recent provocations went down and nothing happened. So the situation is in control. And this happens in the context where our army, the KSF, participated in NATO's military exercises called Euro Defender. And we even hosted those exercises. We're one of the 16, if I'm not mistaken, countries to host it. While, as you mentioned, Serbia participated in the Slavic Shield exercises with Belarus and the Russian Federation. And this military cooperation has increased through years between Serbia and Russia. Prior to Vučić coming to power in 2012, Serbia had only 2 such exercises with Russia. In 2016, they had 50, and last year they had 100. So besides having this security armament buying of weapons from Russia and China, they also have these kind of exercises. And I have to also mention that Serbia has 42 forward operational bases of its army within the borderline in Kosovo. So these are not defensive, these are forward operational bases, and they are all in high alert status. And the meeting that you mentioned last year in 25th of November in Sochi between Vučić and Putin, we saw that meeting with great concern because even the public statement from Vučić, and I will quote here, I will read the right quotation if I may. He says, "I spoke about double standards and often hypocrisy in international relations. President Putin recognizes that and understands well what I'm talking about, but he asked me for additional explanations. So we talked about the north of Kosovo and I showed him on the map." So, I mean, what is the message that is trying to be sent from such kind of meetings and statements? When you have such provocations at the border, when you have 42 forward operational bases, and you have an intelligence center in Niš, close to Kosovo. But also we can take the statement of Mr. Vučić. I believe it was in his electoral campaign where he said, unfortunately, it looks like the war in Ukraine will not be isolated, but it will spread. So within the context of the Srpski svet, the Serbian world that the government of Serbia does not oppose, it legitimizes. So this is a hegemonic project, not only towards Kosovo, but also towards Bosnia and Herzegovina and Montenegro. And we see this. Yeah, I'm sorry. We see this with concerns, but we are vigilant.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to turn to Sabina again. I'd be very interested to hear from you about a few things in terms of Bosnia's response, because you host a variety of different identity groups that are still very much strong and that have kind of hardened as a result of the war also, and as a result from narratives that are being pushed from the top to the bottom. Now, the UK and the US have imposed sanctions against Dodik. The Office of the High Representative has actually exercised these bond powers, which is quite significant, while EUFOR has increased its peacekeeping forces in Bosnia. Now, what's the significance thereof, and will those actions make any difference in terms of stabilizing or transforming, more importantly, the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina? Thank you. You're on mute.
The risk of such actions is that they provide potentially, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily the outcome, but the risk is that they will provide false sense of hope, that we are facing the long simmering issues in Bosnia and Herzegovina as a result of current security crisis in Europe and Western Balkans head on. But the situation on the ground is actually telling us that that's not necessarily the case. Once you list the activities the way you did, it was a leading question, I would say. The increased number of forces is not particularly impressive. I mean, it got some media attention in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but it fools no one that that number of forces may be participating in preventing some kind of incidents or preventing a major security fallout. The number two, when it comes to using bond powers, I don't know what more could the Serb leader do to unnerve the Western powers before the bond powers were used, because the series of legislation was adopted that's essentially, as I said previously, creating a puppet, Russian puppet state in Bosnia and Herzegovina in terms of gaining independence. And it's amazing how we don't believe people when they say what they are aiming to do. He specifically says that the long-term goal is unifying Serbs in Western Balkans. So when you hear that, the fact that many don't believe is actually concerning, particularly that the United States and the EU have been, as I said, practicing policy of appeasement. What will be interesting to see, and I think will tell us what will happen in Western Balkans, actually the way the situation plays out in Ukraine. Because if Ukraine war ends with the Dayton II peace agreement, or some form of Dayton peace agreement, which has been actually a long-term ambition of certain political scientists close to Putin, who have been actually naming Bosnian model as a solution for Ukraine, where half of the country, similar to the Bosnian scenario, would be under the influence and malign foreign influence and under Russian control, whilst remaining within the territory. I mean, while kind of cosmetically supporting the preserving the Ukrainian territorial integrity, but not its sovereignty. So in that sense, what happens in Ukraine and the level of appeasement that the West will be playing in the upcoming months, if not, hopefully not years, will tell us how ambitious are Western powers in Western Balkans. And I said it many times. I said it a couple of days ago in Berlin. I understand the pragmatism of the decision making with Russia in relation to Ukraine. I understand the pragmatic concerns relating to both trade, geostrategy, energy policies, and so on. But what is unjustifiable, simply indefensible, is the policy of appeasement played with a small number of nationalists who are making our lives miserable in Western Balkans. So if the red lines are drawn here, they will most likely be drawn in Ukraine and vice versa. So it will be interesting to see next steps.
Thank you, Sabina. Let's go back to Milena. You said something that was really interesting earlier about, that sounded like you're fairly optimistic that maybe there could be winds of change in Serbia, especially now following this election. And I always like to ask, Serbians, whether they think President Vučić is a thermometer or a thermostat. In other words, is he reflecting the mood, merely reflecting the mood of the people, or is he setting the temperature? And I think he is the latter. Now, that said, how will the outcome of the recent election in Serbia impact this Russia-Serbia relationship? And also, what do you think will be the impact on Serbia's ability to join the EU? I know you are very pro-EU and you're very strong on this issue. So if you'd like to address those points for us, please.
I think he's both. He's both somebody who is following and reacting to a part of his electorate, but he's also somebody who is very strongly influencing the public opinion in Serbia. And we know that a big part of the public opinion in Serbia is being forged through the pro-governmental media, which actually form 90% of the media space in Serbia, unfortunately. So in that sense, we cannot speak about let's say, a very democratic and open media space, which then, the political leadership is somehow sensing and then reacting to it. So it's a very much of a cyclical, I would say, process. And those who follow the public discourse of Vučić and his government also know that they speak at let's say various amplitudes. They speak always to various audiences. Also, we quite clearly understand that in order to have such a wide and strong public support in Serbia, you have to find ways to communicate to those different sentiments. So just by focusing on EU and economy and those positive narratives, you cannot win such a huge political support. At the same time, I would say that the EU is partly, in a way, to blame for such a situation, because over the past years we have seen that the EU has played this game, as Sabina has called it, of appeasement with some quite authoritarian and anti-democratic regimes in Serbia and in the region, and I certainly count the regime in Serbia as one of them. So now I would say that in the middle of this war, I would say that it's a little bit too late to realize that and to change that policy at this point. And I think it would even be quite dangerous to simply, make a complete shift at this point in time. I don't think, and I mean, okay, of course, I know that in Serbia and in Kosovo, there are completely different narratives. When I speak to my friends in Pristina, with whom I work a lot, and we have a lot of regional projects and initiatives, I see and I sense and I understand how much the narratives and the stories and everything is completely not different, but it's completely the opposite, you know. And in Serbia, people say, and you know, all the media and the analysts, everybody is speaking about Kosovo not implementing something in Kosovo. It's the other way around. But at this point in time, I think that it would serve everybody just to try to look for ways to let's say to reduce those sharp narratives and to reduce those, let's say, sentiments of fear and sentiments of you know, somehow creation of the danger, of the sense of danger. I don't think, and at least in the public space in Serbia, nobody expects that there will be any fallout of the war in Ukraine here in the Western Balkans. I think that everybody is focused on keeping the situation in this region calm and peaceful and stable. Unfortunately, I think that that is yet again going to have negative consequences also on the quality of the democracy in our region, because we have seen that recurringly happening in the past years because of such a strong focus on stability, and because let's say the main focus also of the EU has been on maintaining stability, maintaining peace. We have seen raising authoritarian tendencies in the region. But I think that the EU can do more to actually, while not jeopardizing stability and peace, I think it can do more to stimulate reforms and to stimulate pro-European opposition voices, pro-European opposition platforms. And I think it can do that by offering a clearer European EU membership perspective to the countries of the region, and by reforming its own enlargement policy in a way that is going to be more conducive and more incentivizing for the political leaders in the region. I believe, and as an analyst of the EU accession process and EU enlargement policy over the past years, I think that the EU's enlargement policy has lost its transformative power, mainly because EU enlargement process has become an open-ended exercise. It has become, as I call it, a l'art pour l'art exercise. We are negotiating and we are going through the processes for the sake of going through processes. Kosovo has earned its visa liberalization several years ago, and it still doesn't have a visa-free regime. North Macedonia has earned, and even Albania, I mean, some have been more critical towards Albania, but both countries have earned the opening of accession talks, and they still haven't opened accession talks because the EU's enlargement policy has failed in many ways. Even for the countries that are negotiating, the negotiations are not happening as an exercise that is supposed to lead to accession in a foreseeable future. So the political leaders in the region sense that, and they of course follow what's going on in the other countries. So I think that, you know, Bosnian political leaders, Serbian political leaders also see what happens when you make hard political decisions and hard political sacrifices, that, you know, the reward, the promised reward from the EU is often not actually going to come. So I think it is this war, it has really brought to the front the necessity for the EU to reform and to consolidate its enlargement policy, and to make sure that it makes an offer to the region that the region's political leaders will not be able to refuse. And I think that by reforming the policy, my think tank, together with the partners in Brussels, have designed one such proposal, which is called Proposal for Staged Accession to the EU. And this proposal is now being widely discussed, but the whole point is to create a process which is going to deliver in several stages as we come closer to the European Union. And it would be a process that would deliver even for the countries that are formally now lagging behind in the process, but which in that way, through such a gradual process, can actually see benefits of EU membership, increased institutional participation, increased access to funding, even in earlier stages of accession. And I believe that can be quite motivating to the political leaderships in all of the countries in the region.
Thank you. And feel free to drop a link to your proposal also in the comments section for those of us who are interested in that. Let's turn again to you, Kreshnik, please. I know that you fairly recently met with your Ukrainian counterpart. How significant was that meeting in terms of Kosovo-Ukraine relations?
Well, as I said, we still do not have diplomatic relations between the two countries. And I've had a phone call with my counterpart, Deputy Minister Japarova, and I believe it is important for both of the countries to establish that we already established a channel of contact. We, shared our experiences. I informed her on the steps that we've taken. She informed me on the situation on the ground. And we keep this channel of communication active even today. So when Ukraine wins the war, I believe that's going to be a chance for us to meet and see what we can do further.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Sabina, I'm going to turn back to you again, if you could unmute for us. You mentioned earlier Dayton, which of course means different things to different people here in Bosnia. On the one hand, it ended a very violent armed conflict, but at the same time, it sort of set up this Frankenstein of a system, that is kind of hard to live with, and there's a lot of talk. How do we move on from Dayton after all this time has passed? What would you say are the main lessons for Ukraine, having gone through this Dayton peace process?
Look, Bosnia and Herzegovina has always traditionally had some form of power sharing mechanism. And I think that's also traditionally the best part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, that it's multiculturalism and multi-ethnicity came at its best, came naturally to Bosnia and Herzegovina without the rigidity of the Dayton political structure. So for political scientists, I understand that it's not the sexiest topic for wide audiences, but consociationalism, there is no just one single type of consociationalism, power sharing mechanism. There is the rigid corporate one, and there is a more liberal one. We are living in Bosnia and Herzegovina the most rigid form of consociationalism. So my argument is that we need to be moving away, not necessarily entirely from power sharing mechanisms, because we need them. We need to preserve, not because we must, but because we should, and because it's the most, I would dare say, beautiful part of Bosnia and Herzegovina to have the multiculturalism enshrined in our constitution. However, the type we have is not favoring that. It's actually favoring ethnocratic rule, and it's favoring ethnic division. It's not favoring integration. It's actually favoring disintegration, which was proven by the not only European Court of Human Rights decisions, but simply 25 years of life here. So that would be my lesson, essentially for Ukraine, to say, when drawing, I understand there is always a need to succumb to the external pressure of war, which is a necessary thing in peace agreements and in political agreements that are happening while the war is looming above the negotiators' heads. But at the same time, are we creating structures that will harm more in the long term, but just more gradually and less painfully, is the question. So in that sense, I think Dayton should be analyzed in all its pitfalls and all its drawbacks, and what it favored, and the corruption it created, the elites that it created, the turnover of politicians. I mean, I grew up with the same names on the political spectrum, and that tells you a lot. So in that sense, we should be looking at avoiding, I would say, I'm not going to say peace at any cost, but we should be avoiding political structure that will make Ukraine an impossible country.
Thank you, Sabina, for those very wise words also. Set up a system that will breathe life into something better, essentially, and not, restrain some form of liberal democracy. Milena, let's turn to you again. We have a question from one of the audience members about the role played of the Orthodox Church and civil society in terms of the political organization in Serbia. Would you care to comment about that, especially in terms of how that influences the Russia-Serbia relations? And perhaps while we talk about civil society, can you also perhaps comment about how this conflict, the Russia-Ukraine war, has been covered in the Serbian media? And I know that's a very broad question because you have different outlets, but could you maybe give us a taste of that? And you've alluded to something earlier where you've referred to kind of how this conflict was covered pre-election versus now. I don't know if you can give us a little bit of nuance there. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, with regards to the Serbian Orthodox Church, I really cannot comment much more than what I have already said. I mean, I think that the Serbian Orthodox Church is right now in a situation that, there are two Orthodox countries at war, and simply, I think it was the right thing for the Patriarch to meet with Ukrainian refugees, although there was part of the pro-Russian public that even kind of accused or condemned the Patriarch for having done so, which is absolutely incredible. But of course, I mean, there is this part of the public which is, let's say, extremely extremely Russophile. I think that's the term in English as well, and which has gone as far as to condemn the Patriarch for having done so. Other than that, I cannot comment much more. I mean, I'm really not, and I don't consider the Serbian Orthodox Church as part of the civil society in Serbia, although they are, they are a non-governmental organization, but we all know that the church has a very specific role compared to any other part of the civil society. The rest of the civil society, the real civil society, has been very openly pro-Ukrainian. It has been calling and creating domestic pressure for the government to align with the Ukrainian with the Ukrainian position and with the mainstream European position. And I think that we have been quite vocal and to an extent also successful together with the rest of the diplomatic community in Serbia in creating that pressure, but also making it quite clear in terms of what Serbia stands to win and what it stands to lose. And I think that it was right for the EU to create this sentiment of necessity to choose, because this war has brought to light also, let's say, value divisions, and standing with Ukraine has become not only a matter of some national position and what is in the national interest, as the Serbian president used to always insist, but it has become part of what you stand for and what your values are, and it has been a very much value-driven and value-based discussion. So I think we're not there yet, of course, when it comes to this value-driven and value-based discussion. Those of us who are very pro-European in the Serbian public, we are pushing for that, and we are trying to strengthen that part of the narrative. But I also think that a lot of the Serbian public, which is not, let's say, which is not politically motivated in this discussion, also very strongly empathizes with the Ukrainian refugees, because Serbia was also a place where thousands of people fled to during the wars that tore Yugoslavia apart. So I think that there is also a lot of empathy in that sense. And of course, I mean, this is something that is, I think, humane. When it comes to how the war was covered in the Serbian media, this, I mean, I referred to this in the first part of the intervention. It is difficult to make any sort of a clear picture, because, as I said, largest shares of the Serbian media space are controlled by the government and are very close to the government. Of course, in the smaller anti-governmental or more independent media outlets, the situation was much closer, and the coverage was much closer to what you would see in the Western media. But then in the pro-governmental media, we have seen over time very mixed signals and mixed stories, and you could observe even in the same media outlets, and I would choose Informer as one of the best or worst examples of that. you could see completely schizophrenic coverage of the situation just in the course of a couple of days. I mean, Informer actually had a front page after after Russia attacked Ukraine. It had one of the first headlines which stated Ukraine has attacked Russia. So this is how far they were able to go. But then over time, this part of their coverage subdued, and they started to show more and more of news headings such as Putin is creating a catastrophe in Russia. We are all going to end up in nuclear war because of Putin. So they started to shift everything against Putin, and they even started to, make very strong, let's say, articles and headings which were very strongly empathizing with Ukraine and with the situation in Mariupol, for example, etc. And I think we are seeing a shift there. We can also see that there are individual articles which still favor Putin. And I think those specific articles are part of the direct pro-Russian propaganda in Serbia. But this only shows that Russian propaganda is just a small share of what actually influences Serbian media. I think that this large shift which we are seeing is actually showing that it is the domestic government which is dictating these media outlets, not directly Russian propaganda. So
Perfect.
I think that by the fact that we are seeing this, and I was referring, for example, to one of the shows on TV Happy, which is one of the most widely seen pro-governmental TV stations in Serbia, and there is this famous political show Ćirilica run by Milovan Maric. It is something that I personally never see, but I saw this one episode because for me it was so unbelievable. It was 4 pro-European, pro-NATO experts analyzing and actually dictating to the Serbian public why Serbia needs to be on the EU side, and even somehow it was even creating a pro-NATO sentiment. So I think this is something that was just unseen before in this specific TV show. So this is why I think that there is reason to be optimistic, and I think that we are going to see more of that.
Thank you, Milena. I hope you are right. I'm now going to turn
We all hope
again.
Milena is right.
Yes.
A bit skeptical, but hope.
Yes, of course. All right, let's turn to Kreshnik again. I'll ask you to be very, very brief so that we can do one quick round of questions to each person. Since before the February escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war, but especially following it, there's been a big push coming from Kosovo to join both the EU and NATO. Now, why is it so important for Kosovo to join those organizations? What have you done to achieve those goals or to work towards those goals? And what reaction have you been receiving now following the escalation of the conflict from both EU and NATO? Thank you.
I'll try to be short. First of all, we share the same values with EU and NATO. So that is the principal reason why. And also we believe that Kosovo becoming a full member of NATO would contribute not only to Kosovo itself, but also to the regional and European stability. And we have, this year, we will apply for the EU membership. That's a decision that our government has already taken. And we understand that we cannot become overnight a member of EU, either EU or either NATO, but a form of a more intensive cooperation should take place. And I agree with Milena that we shouldn't have a narrative that creates tension. But from the facts that we see on the ground, I cannot say that we're not concerned. So becoming a part of NATO and also becoming a part of EU, I believe would help not only us, but the region, you know. Regarding the answers, we haven't approached them officially yet, so no official communication on this topic until now.
Okay, let's hope, as Milena pointed out, that visa liberalization will also be in the works soon from the EU side. Then let's turn to Sabina again. I want to give you a double question there, because you are a former debate champion after all. So first question is, how should the EU, UK, and US respond to the situation here in Bosnia and Herzegovina? Because we have seen some interesting actions from these different actors over the last few months. And depending on who you talk to, it either is helping Bosnia or it's not. So I'd be keen to hear what you say about that. Then there's also a question from one of our audience members who's asking about Macron. And he is one of the European leaders meeting Putin in recent months. What level of influence does France have in the Balkans, and what impact would it make if Le Pen wins this weekend? So, two tough questions for you.
Well, that would just complete the puzzle, because we already have Orban, we have Janša, we have Vučić, and we have Dodik in Bosnia, and the Le Pen is the missing puzzle, and it will be met with, I would say, great enthusiasm by the most destructive people in the Western Balkans. So for sure, we are looking at those elections as well. And it was a sad night with the Orban's victory, and we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens in France. But going back to your question, Leon, about the what the international community should do in Western Balkans, I'll tell you a little thing that I was told by a person working for a German foreign ministry. And I was asking about the potential change of course and the more proactive possibility of a more proactive stand in Western Balkans. There was a long-standing close relations between CDU and HDZ party, which is another nationalist party in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for nationalist Croat party in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and so on. And the person said an interesting thing, and they said, you know, in large systems such as a German government, and same goes probably for in some respect for US government, foreign offices are huge tankers, gigantic ships that are driven by their own inertia and simple size. To make U-turns, it's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult for a major change of course, because the administrations are too large, and even when new people after many decades do come, or even after 1 or 2 terms in the United States, the inertia of certain policy keeps going even after the kind of a realization had been made that the course is not the most successful or most useful one. And that's the inertia that I'm afraid of. There is as you mentioned, there are things here and there, but I think the tanker is still moving in the same, unfortunately, in the same direction of finding long-term solutions, short-term solutions at the expense of long-term stability. This is the problem. The one thing I would recommend is Bosnia and Herzegovina and Western Balkans are a perfect place to test braver, more visionary foreign policies. The politicians that they are afraid of and who they're appeasing, not afraid of, but whom they're appeasing for the sake of short-term solutions, are inconsequential for world politics. There is nothing that Dodik can do to threaten. He threatened Germany with sanctions. I mean, that's how ridiculous these people are. They're mediocre at best. So in that sense, to see large superpowers or significant European powers playing to these people, it's disheartening, not just for Bosnians. I mean, let's say you don't care about the future of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but you should care about your leaders kind of kneeling down for just a couple of criminals, to put it bluntly. And, you know, this could be a visionary, this could be a playground for visionary policy that, if it succeeds, it can bring incredible amount of benefit, and I would say bravado and confidence to international community, whereas its failure may be actually quite dangerous for the entire Europe.
Thank you, Sabina. I mean, you're quite right, and it is depressing to think that course correction when it comes to policy is often a very difficult, tedious exercise. But I think you're also right in that, you know, the Balkans the Balkan region is small enough for US, EU, and UK to do a little bit, and it will go a far way, you know, and we should stop appeasing some of these small actors, you know, in a manner that we've done in the past. But yeah, let's turn now again to Milena for perhaps the final words. I'm gonna ask you again. Let's tap into your the pro-European in you. I'll ask you right now. Serbia is sitting on 3 or more chairs, depending on who you ask. Right? There's the Western one, there's the Russian one, there's the China one. Is it time for Serbia to choose a chair, or alternatively, how should we keep Serbia on the right path at this point?
Yes, I absolutely do think that it's time for Serbia to choose the chair. And I think that the EU has done already quite a good job in making that quite clear to the Serbian leadership. And I think we're going to see more of that. I mean, to my knowledge and with the information that I have, the EU member states are in constant dialogue to make sure that Serbian leadership receives this message, but also to kind of, you know, create some incentives for the Serbian leadership to actually choose the right side. Obviously, I think that the EU does understand that for a country that has for years been building such strong relations with Russia, especially in terms of energy supplies, it cannot just overnight break those ties. And I think Germany is one of the EU countries which understands that the most. So we have been advocating, and I think that the EU member states and the EU leadership has already done a lot, and I hope they will do more to actually help Serbia and the entire region. Of course, this doesn't go only for Serbia. I mean, we also know, for example, that Montenegro has a lot of dependencies on Russian tourism, in its own smaller economic context. So every country has its own specificities, but in Serbia, it's specifically related to dependency on Russian gas and presence of Russian oil companies in the Serbian market. So I think that the EU will do more to help Serbia, let's say, disconnect from or reduce these dependencies from Russia in the course of the coming years. And I think that it will, and I think it should do that in the same way that it deals with its own economies. So I think that we have already seen now that the latest European Council meeting has proposed for the Western Balkans to be included in the joint public procurements for gas at EU level. I think that such decisions need to be stepped up. Also, the EU mended one mistake that it made when it enacted its own decisions on restrictive measures towards Russia, where it forgot to include Western Balkans in the exemptions from limitations of import of Russian oil. We have seen subsequently that the EU has fixed this mistake. So I think that the EU needs to do more to ensure that it does not forget about the Western Balkans when it makes its own decisions targeting, to deal and to reduce the consequences of the different kinds of fallout from this war. But I also think that it will be important for the EU to do more to include the Western Balkan countries in those decisions. For example, one of the things that the EU could do is to already include those Western Balkan countries which have aligned with the EU's position vis-a-vis Russia and with its restrictive measures, to include it in all of the discussions about the implementation of the sanctions. That would be extremely helpful for the governments of those countries when they discuss and when they determine how they're going to go about the implementation and what are the consequences and how they will be mitigated. And that would also create more of a sentiment of belonging and of community together with the EU. It would also create an additional pressure on countries that have not aligned, because then they would be the only ones excluded from that kind of a dialogue. So I think it would send a very positive message to the region. And as I said, I think we need the EU to really, let's say, cement its geopolitical footprint in the region with this war. As a result of this war, I think this is, a crisis which needs to be, at least in this sense, it needs to be seen as an opportunity for the EU to do what it has to do in the region, and to ensure that in the future we do sit on the right chair here in Serbia.
Thank you, Milena. So we started with chairs and we ended with chairs, this discussion. And with that, I would like to conclude this event. We dropped a link, and we would like to support the LSE Student Union fundraiser that was set up for Ukrainian refugees. And I'd like to thank all three of our speakers joining us, from Kosovo, Bosnia, and Serbia, who have contributed to this very interesting discussion. I'd like to remind our audience members also the Russia-Ukraine Dialogues every Tuesday. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.